I dream, therefore I am. I'm incredibly excited to share around culture, creative arts, connectivity, and commerce. It's really an exciting time to be on the continent or to appreciate the beautiful things in different spaces that the continent is sharing, especially to do with creative arts. And today in my session, I'd love to take you through some of the highlights that we've been able to see, some of the tension points, especially thinking about commerce and the creative arts industry, and of course, to celebrate some of our own, thinking about the Grammys and thinking about our place and recognition of the Grammys, but maybe pushing a little bit and having you reimagine what would it look like if Africa had our own Grammys and we decided to have North America as a category, Asia as a category, and what that would mean for power shifting, placement, and opportunity. My name is Emmanuel Gamor, and I'm excited to welcome you to this segment of UJ's Future and Beyond Forum. I dream, therefore I am. For me, I think creativity gives us space. It gives us an opportunity to be validated in a way that potentially other spaces do not allow for. And for a lot of us, those of us who think, dream as children, creativity allows us to be as children. And for a lot of those who are thinking about it, the myriad of countries, the myriad of languages, the myriad of cultures that are expressed, especially from my continent in Africa, you wonder, why doesn't creativity have a stronger global presence? Why is it not being used as a tool to validate our efforts, to recognize our historical context, and most importantly, as a tool to allow for things like equity within a time where we're looking at Black Lives Matter, within a space where we're looking at equity and gender, as well as compensation spaces. And then for me, a student of what we may consider the convergence of technology, or 4IR, how do we reimagine Africa's future and understanding that the creative arts represents our culture? An interesting thought I would like to submit for you, using a bit of a business school lens. And I say that smiling a bit, because one of the things I struggle with is this dichotomy of informal and formal businesses. And unfortunately for a lot of us, our creative arts, by extension, our culture, is delineated into this informal segment, which doesn't make any sense. Commerce, you're trading for value. Usually you're giving something in return for worth of something that's presented. It's very difficult for me, particularly, to think of something informal or formal if it fits into commerce. And when I have conversations with numerous artisans, people in the creative industry, people in fashion, people who do all kinds of beautiful things by sharing their culture and experience through trinkets, jewelry, artifacts, and paintings, it makes absolutely no sense for that to be considered informal. It might be deliberate, but I'll leave you to figure that out. When we think about commerce and what it means to reimagine that, and what validation creative arts creates for those of us who are hinged in our culture, then maybe we should future cast and say, how do we embrace commerce in its totality? How do we embrace creative arts in a way that unifies, but also celebrates individuality? And hopefully some of these sentiments that I share with you would help us think through, not necessarily in the near distance or future, but in the now. One of the other things that's a tension for me, as I was thinking about this program, as I was thinking about my lived experience, as I was thinking about my submissions for this particular segment, was sustainability. And for me, I love everything that has to do with our culture. But thinking about, how do we sustain that? How do we encourage our creatives and artists to be able to deliver in a way that their livelihoods are supported, deliver in a way that their imaginations are buttressed on foundations and opportunity. They don't have to think about hustle or what the family's going to eat or how big an idea can be. We can see some of those expressions in successful sectors, right? Hollywood, a mishmash of really movie distributors, and some would say a mafia collection of folks who decide what shows and movies get to be shown. And if you look at that historical order, we may glean a couple of lessons from that. How do we build our own spaces to showcase our own talents that allows commercialization, that supports our creativity in a world that traditionally hasn't? Lots of our historical artifacts have been exploited and or looted. It's not my place to share that with you. You can easily Google that. But what I'd like for you to think about is, as we think about sustainability and commercialization, we also hold pause and think deeply about commodification. How do we commercialize, give opportunity for people who are artists and creatives to share their craft without reducing what is their talent, what is their offering, into commodities? That's an interesting one, isn't it? As I'm sharing this with all of you, I'd love for you to drop questions in this segment, in this section, comment section. I'd love to read, and I'd be happy to share my thoughts on some of them. We may disagree, but do feel free to share. And back on this commercialization question. So part of my learning journey includes attending a business school, creating business cases for digital assets, physical assets, giving advice to entrepreneurs. And we can take lessons from different communities, right? So when I talk about commodities, think of it as popular commodities that are on a stock exchange. Agriculture is a good example, right? You have corn, cattle, sheep, what have you. One of my favorite economics class used to ask, if you had a cornmeal, if you had pap, if you had kenke, if you had a burrito, how do you determine the value of one burrito when the historical context of making that burrito is so vast? From the chefs, from the kitchen spaces that put it together, all the way to the farmers, to the knowledge of nurturing each of those plants, to that individual bite of that meal, cornmeal that you had. That's intriguing, isn't it? But then once it becomes commoditized on the global market, then you have things like demand and supply, access. Then something that has taken generations, months of harvesting, prospecting, and hope along the value chain becomes commodified. And in some spaces, you have some geniuses making it even more devalued in a space that we say we want or can only afford less than a rand, less than a cedi, less than $1 for a specific food item, right? So when you talk to farmers, when you talk to food scientists, there's a much larger appreciation for a commodity like corn than there is for cornmeal, for a scoop of pop, or for cornflakes. Let's apply that to art, or let's apply that to fashion. And this shirt that I'm wearing, right? So I happened to pick this up from NALM. The NALM team are based in Ghana, West Africa. Greg Kanko and his team own maybe for anywhere between $20 to $50. And you can translate that to your local currency wherever you're at. You can get a shirt like this. But you ask yourself, what's the value of this? What did it take to put this together? My main point in saying that we should not, or we should hold pause and think deeply about commodifying our creative arts is that, yes, we need to commercialize. We need to find value for expressing this. There are quite a couple of reports, MasterCard funded, We the People delivered, that talks about the opportunity of the creative arts industry, especially when it's shared to the global audience, and especially when local artisans can have foreign currency. But as we future cast for that type of commerce within our creative arts, especially sharing our culture, we should hold pause that we don't commodify. Because within that thinking, you end up excluding a lot of folks who added to the value chain who don't have a space to negotiate. That's an intriguing idea. And you may be like wondering, Emmanuel, so how do we do that? How do we have culture, creative arts, connected to a global audience, sustainability through thinking for commerce, but be intentional so that we don't lose value for the artisans, for the creators, most of who have dedicated their lives to a specific task that makes this what we appreciate? I don't have all the answers, but there may be a few examples that we may need to adopt within our communities as we think of 4i art, as we think of commercialization. Two of those, one from the United States, Milton Hershey and Hershey chocolates, for those who are a fan. I love chocolates because I'm, again, being born in Ghana, appreciation of cocoa and chocolates, it's a fine point. But if you look at Hershey and their trust, in creating corporate trust that first speaks to the orphanage that Milton Hershey and the founder were passionate about, we can start to say that when we start to commercialize the creative arts industry, we must be intentional that the communities where these things are extracted from, be it the farming community, be it the creative arts, textiles, industries, there should be a trust in which the profits that is taken from this in commercialization is returned to. I'll give another example, and that's more in the global south. And that speaks to the founders of Tata Industries and the idea of social corporate or corporate social responsibility. Read up on the phenomenal journey of Tata. It is a great example of a company that not only has been able to push innovation globally from India to the rest of the world, but is intentional in sectors such as healthcare, education, leadership building through the various Tata companies, but also doing that much needed work of human development before their talents can be commercialized in the place of work. I would love to take some of your questions. I know that we have you for a brief moment of time. Excellent. Well, another thinking or thought that I said I'd share with you guys has to do with validation in space. And so thinking about culture, thinking about creative arts, thinking about how we're connected, and also thinking about how we can make it sustainable are all the ways in which we can magnify and amplify our daily lives. One of them is the internet, different platforms, and another is by validated ceremonies or touch points. Growing up, I've always heard about the Oscars and I've heard about the Grammys. And as I alluded to in my earlier submission, definitely wanted to congratulate Burna Boy, Wizkid, Tiwa Savage, Nigerian artists who have been phenomenal in putting out consistent body of work. For those of you who've been part of their team, and I had the privilege of interviewing Burna Boy and Y1079 FM, Ghana's version of South Africa's YFM, earlier on in the days, it was incredibly rewarding to see his journey, especially when he started off sampling Angelique Kidjo's music and then competing with her and eventually losing for the one category that all of Africa's music was placed in last year. For me, it was a full circle moment. But then it also made me think of it. The Grammys, as we all know, North American rewarding institution, and is intentional for specific reasons. Some of them I can think about is one, to promote North American music. Two, to validate, and this is something that the United States does very well. I went to college there, and they call American football, or at least the championship game of American football, really, it's almost thought of as the World Cup series. Same thing with baseball, same thing with hockey. The assumption that other countries and the lack of participation or interest doesn't really matter to Americans. It still gets the tag of world, the audacity of world, right? And it's the same thing whenever we think of the Oscars or the Grammys, with few people really reading into the historical reason for it. But for a lot of artists, a lot of folks who are creative from our continent, there's almost a prescribed attachment that I'm only world famous if I win an Oscar. I'm only world validated if I win a Grammy. And it's okay for you to choose what metric of success you want. But again, where I hold pause is, what happens if we create a world record opportunity by Africa, and we decide to create a category for all of America's artists, lump in all of those who are country singers, pop artists, R&B, and then hopefully I like Beyonce. Give Beyonce the award. There would be a fervor because it wouldn't be a true appreciation of the various genres of music that we've had the opportunity to experience. For me, that's important, right? Because as we grapple with what creativity means for us, what expressions of our culture gets showcased, we need to start to be architects of these validating points. Not necessarily because we want to categorize the United States or Europe or French or German music into these demeaning categories. I'm not sharing this with you for us to replicate the tradition of exploitation. The reason why I'm sharing it is when you switch the metrics and say, instead of the Oscars, we have the FADA award ceremony. And within that, we express all of our cultures in music, all of our cultures in different genres of expression. We can now start to undo some of the things that we're fighting for. And we can also start to give a signal to our children that from Africa also is global. And there have been a couple of award ceremonies. Some of them have not had the sustainability that the Oscars has had. I used to have and I still do, dabble in journalism, and I'm a trained journalist. For those of you who don't know, there's a tradition in journalism that is only after a decade of consistent, sometimes daily publication, that the state or community recognize as either the brand, the newspaper, or the media house as a community staple. A lot of times we look at some of these global brands, global media outlets, and these are showcases for our culture being our everyday lived experiences. And the only value proposition they have, and some of us forget and we don't recognize, is longevity. So to come back full circle, the Grammys can only matter if we make it matter. We need to make our own metrics of validation matter, and then create categories of where we want the world to be placed. And if they're not happy with it, they can negotiate. And potentially, they can have a hashtag. We'll read it too. I know these may sound a bit controversial. I know they may not be as friendly to all my audience who are probably watching. But I think that it's important for us to negotiate what it means, particularly from where I'm from where my people are from, our place in the world. Not from a place of not having power and constantly demanding for space, but from a place of us architecting and reimagining what it looks like, because we do have the tools. And for those who are excited about this, if you're just getting into the creative arts industry, if by me connecting some of the dots between culture, creative arts, our community, the ways in which we're connected now, and commerce is exciting for you, I submit for you to have a clean sheet of paper, be audacious. I submit to you, if you have any award scheme, just add world to it. It's fine too. And most importantly, be consistent in your excellent delivery. I'll be keen to watch, to support, and see where we go from there. I can see quite a number of questions have been asked on the Facebook page. You guys are watching from the UJ Futures and Beyond page. Please go ahead. I'll be happy to answer some of them now.
David says, hi, Emmanuel. What role does collaboration between the arts and technology play? And what conversations can be had in order for this to be achieved?
Oh, great question. I think for most of us, and dealing with folks who either are apprehensive about technology, we see technology specifically in digital, and we appreciate technology, albeit as if it's only external. Technology is anything that helps us do better, right? So at a point, the wheel was technology. At a point, dynamite, sheets of paper, writing was technology. And I bring these up because they're not necessarily global south fitting. Some of these came from the Orientals, from Asia, some of them from Greece, Rome, being able to scribe ancient Africa. The points of identifying or articulating clearly how arts finds its role in technology is two things. One, it removes the sentiments of other, as if we cannot participate, even if we were not the originators. And usually it's not even about being originator, is those who can commercialize, right? So we think of all the technologies, your laptop, your cell phones, you ascribe specific companies to them. Most of them are not the originators. They're the ones who've been able to create commercial value, and they're the companies that own intellectual property on them. Where arts intersects is one, allowing us to negotiate, appreciate it, that these things are made for our daily lives. And by extension, two, we can give feedback on what technologies we adopt and which ones we allow our children to create, and how we validate it by paying for and continuing to use them. I think what if we create a world where technology is more informed intimately by our arts and culture, which is our way of living, we would probably start to meet some of the metrics of collective good and improvement rather than the metrics of profits and shareholder value. And those are my submissions on that.
Daniela asks, do you think the value gap is a narrative issue or a branding issue, or is it just an issue of creatives not having business acumen?
So the value gap is, I don't think it's just one metric. It's a wicked problem. And I think you highlighted three potential subgroups. If you're a student of economics, value is really what somebody's willing to pay for. And if you've been given a narrative of appreciating a specific thing, and we can see that intrinsically with colorism, for example, the value that people have allowed a lot of us, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and in some spaces, Latin America, is to create value which is very imagined and artificial, particularly on lighter skin, with no logical or commercial validation whatsoever. And in that space, narrative is incredibly strong and powerful that way. Another, though, is also like appreciation based on complexity or originality. And I bring these two in to show that some of the things that you've mentioned are helpful in thinking about it. But the value gap is a bit more than that. Think about it a bit as another wicked problem in educating for the future. You have to be thinking about what you want the outcome for people to become. So you have to be thinking what you want the outcome for our commercialized creative arts and creative industry to be. And you need multiple stakeholders, buyers and sellers, creatives and marketers, to be aligned in creating the optimal value. We're coming into the narrative game much late. We're coming into the global markets game later because we did not architect or create it, nor do we own the narrative. And so those things seem to be priority, but it's a lot more than that.
I have a question. With the movement or the call for decolonization, we're seeing a return to African spirituality, to valuing heritage that has been passed down, that has not been like written down, codified. How do you see that movement towards this kind of reclaiming the past intersecting with the technological space?
Oh, that's a good one. I had a really interesting conversation with a close friend of mine, and one of the things that I've been actively working on is how do we bring expressions of something we've seen work in the absence of government intervention, external validation, and corporate funding, really co-working spaces, innovation centers, because the early days of these have been a lot of young people saying we don't have enough assets or resources to be corporate, but we need to corporatize in order to be able to have funding. And so the early expressions of accelerator spaces, innovation hubs, and others has really been a response to community need for access to funding. And one of the things I have not seen is to have that or sampling of that being tested within our artisanal space, creative space, and also more in what others would call informal engagement. The movement of spirituality and the reclaiming, I don't think is necessarily a reclaiming as it is in an absence, and now we are demanding the presence of acknowledging how a lot of people live. And I think that it's incredibly important that for those who are being newly exposed to this, we've had a lot of foreign religion, foreign cultures, foreign ways of thinking consistently bombarded on us and were negotiated within our leadership, economic, and political spheres as a concession for us having political independence. And so we now almost seem to be reclaiming something that's always been ours, expressing something that we almost do in the myriads of our faith, in the myriad expressions of our thinking, in spaces, and it seems like it's reclamation, but it's now lauding something that is our very essence. And if we now look at it in that space, we engage with it differently. It should not be contrary to you, with whatever religion you practice now, your family practices now, has adopted whatever myriad of names. It is a continuation of your line because culture is dynamic, not static.
Love that. Love that. Talk to us about the digital divide, young people on the continent, and access. I'm thinking about how the digital divide has become almost like a survival line, particularly now during COVID. Access is a major issue. There's rampant inequality on the continent. But then you see people like Elsa Majimbo uses a simple platform, TikTok on her phone, blows up internationally. Right? So can you talk to us about the pros and the cons of this digital divide and maybe some of the ways in which young people on the continent are innovating?
Absolutely. I think digital is actually incredibly fascinating because the early principles of digital were supposed to be democratizing information. And so to the research groups that initially started this, their intention was, how do we create knowledge transfer in a decentralized space? And how does that knowledge transfer then help empower people that traditionally haven't? The challenge has always been accounting and economics. How do you create that sustainability for public good in spaces when either government agencies or communities aren't built to sustain that? And part of what I was sharing with you was, we need to create companies that are trusts to communities, companies that are trusts to knowledge sharing by demographic and segments. And the reason I answer this question, because you narrow the digital divide in a way that then young people seem to be the ones that have engagement for opportunities. And I'm for that. I advocate, I specifically am next gen focused. But then in a conversation with a colleague, I was also challenged in saying, then how do we carry older folks or adult generation within this digital journey? And the divide really comes from access, but it's even more pronounced in engagement. And so a lot of folks and quite a number of reports that are exciting when you're in the tech space, entrepreneurs, whereas fintech, climate tech now, and all kinds of other spaces, one of the stats that's thrown around quite often is there are more cell phones on the African continent than there are people. Yeah. But when you sift that down, there are less engaged people on the basic utility of the cell phone than the available cell phone. So you can have the physical equipment, but are you having the engagement that unlocks the potential that internet access was supposed to give? And are you able to do that in the sense that it empowers young people in infrastructure gaps like access to knowledge, access to validation, and access to co-creation in a space that young people feel connected to the world? The reason why I am excited about young people, I think there may be a few older Beacon folks maybe ask me this question when I'm a bit older. I'm definitely young and young at heart. But in spite of these challenges, there are a myriad of young people who do amazing. Prince Jesse, who's an iPhone photographer, and he was a very shy young man in an unplugged studio setup, and he couldn't afford DSLR cameras. So during my time at Google and YouTube, I was advocating and was actually a bit upset. They no longer pay me, so I can say this publicly. YouTube came up with a campaign to create YouTube studios across the world. Where did they create and put these studios? In all the top, beautiful global north countries. New York, Los Angeles, France, Paris. And most of these places didn't have the bottleneck of paying for expensive video equipment. And where you rightly highlight is the advent of mobile technology and platforms like TikTok have allowed young people to be creators. But to be deep innovators and engagers of the platform, we're still lagging behind. And for those who are watching and listening, whatever space that you're an artist or creative, to the earlier point about arts and technology needing to marry, you can redefine every app and every phone. If you visit Asian countries, they don't read things from left to right. Their apps are not anything like what we have in your stock Android process. They are unpacked, redone, reimagined. I was in Singapore and I looked at their maps. My God, it was a colorful kaleidoscope of, in my head, confusion. But that's a map. And it challenged me because it meant that the group of people who don't necessarily accept technology, the digital divide, in the way that it's presented. And so for those who are watching on our continent, we do have the opportunity, and we should have the audacity to redesign the interface, the utility. And I see a lot of young people doing that, from comedy to animation, Leti Arts. Kenya, YouTube has a partnership with a Shihiro, especially around Steam and using that character. So for those of you in North America, you're thinking of your Dora Explorer, but the Kenyan version, and much better. There are a myriad of digital expressions now. And because we're connected through the internet and decently accessible devices, the potential to see young dreams and hopefully older visions realized is incredibly possible.
Is there one in the
Yeah, there's a few. We still have quite a bit of time, so half an hour.
Okay.
So you know. I've lost it here. My bad. Zolani says, I love what you said about the arts and how Africa can create its own award ceremony that can directly promote and validate African creativity and art.
Absolutely. I say that because, and I'm not invalidating any of the music awards, movie awards that I've seen, and those are specifically really big categories. I think 5 years ago, I enjoyed watching both Afrobeats and some Francophone country artists come to South Africa and be celebrated. And I think South Africa does a great job of these grand, open to the world events. But I think where we start to fall short is when you think about the value that the Grammys and Oscars has, and you watch any of the historical videos, they have been celebrating themselves consistently, listing their producer director spaces for decades without fail. And it's a phenomenal feat, right? And if you look at some of the early ceremonies, they weren't that great. And if you look at some of how the Academy's rubric was, it wasn't amazing either. There's always been critique, right? But where you cannot knock them off, unless there's been an apocalypse, there's been consistency. And so when I share this idea of us having an award ceremony, it is an opportunity for us to have validation, but it's a responsibility for us to continue giving a historical record of us and our friends that create things that we can also show to the world and say, well, we commended ourselves. And similar to all of these other global reward schemes, our children would aspire for that. And I think when you think about it that way, it removes the apprehension. I apologize to the Grammy architects. It does remove a lot of luster and magic from it, but really that's all you've done. And hopefully to a lot of folks who think about creative arts or the creative economy, you may not identify yourself to be somebody who makes jewelry, beads, who raps, who makes music and melodies. You may identify yourself to be a systems thinker or an events curator, or to be somebody who's on logistics side, or to be somebody who just likes awards. The creative economy needs all of us in that thinking space. And I think the reason why I present that is because some of the folks who also affiliated with the Academy They're not necessarily the directors or the content creators as we know and enjoy them, but they found a space. And so even as I share this singular idea of my own and how we validate, I also submit to you that it's quite limited because of what I've seen. So you can reimagine other validation touch points that maybe North Americans, Parisians, the British monarchy, and others have not discovered yet. And we can be the ones that set that pace. It might not be the next Netflix, it might be something different. It might not be the next Clubhouse, it might be something completely different. But when you do, please add world to it and be consistent. And I think that reimagination allows us to put a foot stamp on what is ours, to create a foundation on what our descendants can also live up on. And also let the world know that we're not negotiating for the limited spaces in which they may offer in protest. And for me, the biggest part about it, the most audacious part, to have creative freedom to include who we want and who we don't want. So yes, please go ahead and create as many validating shows with empathy, with intentionality, and consistency.
Mia asked, what would your advice be for a young creative just entering the industry to better understand the value chain?
Oh, great question. First of all, you're valid. I don't think you're entering the industry, you're already in it. Once you understand that, it's either, and I think a lot of people have these pithy, especially in entrepreneur space of the futurists, you see that you're on the table or you're being eaten. All these, the reality is we are, like, once you are existing, whether directly or indirectly, you're contributing to culture and it's being commercialized. I'm a lifelong learner, so constantly open yourself up to learning. I think that whatever creative outputs, whatever commercial activity that you do, this cycle of constantly exposing yourself to new knowledge, and it may not be new knowledge to the world, it's just new knowledge to you, would help you grow as an artist. The other part, which is usually the bottleneck for creatives entering value chain, and I'm not good at numbers, I don't like math, accounting is boring. And that's fine. Not everybody, and it's crazy because I might be one of the few people that can dabble both minds and not feel like I'm apprehensive towards it. But my accounting friends are terrified by trying to draw a straight line with a paintbrush on a plain canvas. Can you imagine? See how ridiculous it sounds to you as a creative, right? That's the same way it should be when you're thinking about accounting. These are muscles that can be learned. But even more so, you don't need to be an expert in everything. You just need to find your collaborators that understand the spirit and intention. Right? So 1, be a lifelong learner as a creative. 2, have a touch point understanding of what an economy is and adding value, right? And 3, like Will Smith says, hire the best damn people to make you look good. Will Smith is not great at forecasting how movies are going to be. He's probably not great at logistics and hiring DOPs and others. Definitely not super great at script writing. He's a phenomenal actor, incredible confidence, and he has hired some of the most phenomenal people around him. Same or similar with Beyonce. She has incredibly deep talent as a performer. She's been validated with 20 plus Grammys as a lyricist and a singer. One of the only females in the top 4 list of American world performers to be acknowledged that way. Her team is kick-ass. I saw her concert with Jay-Z here in South Africa a couple of years ago, and it was so apparent. There was an amazing event happening, first 4 or 5 hours. When Beyonce's set came on, it felt like you had gone from grade school to the College of Stage Execution. The mics were different. The started to respond. And it's not because Beyonce is an expert at mic setup or an expert at stage props. She's found a collaboration of people who understand her spirit and intent and she empowers them to co-create. Same thing with Black is King. For those of you who may have criticized Lion King movie, but the album, and a couple of good friends were on that album. Blitz, the ambassador, aka Bazaar, and I've seen his work and also followed his trail in becoming global. And a couple of friends, including those that help manage Beyonce's creative industry, and then some of them, Sharifa, who was also part of the process in helping them fit the clothes and the creative design on set for what some of the folks were wearing, right? Beyonce is a great performer, but I can bet a couple of dollars she did not pick all of the dancers' clothes, or she did not pick which aspects of the set design would trend. But she did find the genius, and it's probably you at home. You know, you feel it, you live it. And in that collaboration, gave us that masterpiece, which we celebrate as well.
Thank you. Barbara says, what you're saying about making sure the artist or artisan value is not lost is so important. Artistic work is valuable, but often the monetized value, the money, goes, that's unfair, she said, da money, exclamation mark, goes to other than the creative artist.
Yes. I think Barbara could be my professor from Florida, Dr. McDade. She's an amazing woman. Her and her husband also teach in Ghana.
It's Barbara McDade.
Yes.
Wow.
She's an amazing, she was a mentor. She was a director for a mentorship program that I took part in 15 years ago.
Wow.
So thank you again for following my journey, Dr. McDade. Absolutely. I think, and this is something that's really interesting because I think this year has been the year that I could reflect and synthesize a lot of my thoughts. There are a few years where I was just trying to be a student of business and commercialization. And when you look at creative arts, if you look at music agencies, if you look at theaters and ticket sellers, they're a bit removed from the content creators. So typically, the way that we've created commercialization models is that they're gatekeepers, literally. They open and close the gates to the music or creative experience, and they're the ones who are given the privilege of business acumen, given the privilege of value negotiation. And that's what separates the money and access to content creators. And where I empathize with content creators is most folks in the creative industry, they present their hearts and their spirits in what they create. That negotiation of presenting your mind and thinking and profiteering is a completely different muscle. And for some folks, it bastardizes or dumbs down their gift to the world. And it's a very traumatic experience if you are creative and you learn the science of profiteering and commercialization. Because the world of ecosystem building that we've done in commercialization does not necessarily validate or value the artist's creation in the way that they may see it. I'll give a great example. I used to be on radio, and a lot of times when you'd ask your favorite musician, what is their favorite track or favorite album? And you can try that on YouTube. Google some of your favorite artists, just Google what their interviews have been, and a question on what they think their own most valuable project is. In my experience, 8 out of 10, I've not heard the track before. It didn't trend on the top 100. It didn't resonate on commercialized value. It wasn't the track or music offering that got them the Grammys or the awards. And then that makes me also think a bit. And it means that there is a disconnect between the validators of commercialization and the money, and then the gift offering. And I think we need to recalibrate that and find multiple ways of allowing folks who are creatives to give their gift offering and of their full selves and be compensated for that. And also allow for this, what I think is really a dumbed down, exploitative commercialization model. It seems to pay the bills in a specific setting, but it's not resilient. It's not empathetic. It ends up creating a lot of our cultural seers, and some of them have been phenomenal people. Your Whitney Houstons, your Michael Jacksons. These are tender people who decided to commit themselves to constantly give of their gifts. And you can name your neighborhood celebrity, and at the peak of their lives, some of them don't feel validated, supported. And these two I mentioned because they've received commercial success as we see it, and they've made the money. But it means that the model is broken. And if we're observant, and if we're truly in a space of building for better, we need to create better for them and for ourselves.
Sorry, you're blowing our minds over here. We're all like losing our minds. Barbara says, this is so much the motivation for the Center of Art, Migration and Entrepreneurship at the University of Florida College of the Arts. The Dean of COA is a Nigerian American whose mission is to make the arts more inclusive, more truly international, not like the World Series in baseball, which includes only US teams. Quintus says, I agree. We have to think globally. Some of our most valuable exports from Africa is our culture. We need to value it more. Think of Beyonce's latest album or the movie Black Panther.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that maybe I'll share, and I don't watch as much TV as I should, but one of the critique that I remember happening, especially and this is before Shonda Rhimes almost has a mind-blowing dominance in American TV show culture. There are lots of TV shows in America that are rebranded either from Asian TV and TV shows. And it's so fascinating how many other cultures have much deeper resonating storylines that are adaptable to American culture. And because of the global facing nature of American TV, we accept and assume that that's the originality of it. And so when I hear the affirmations of these, I also want to hear the empowerment of our business opportunists and business opportunities to stretch their imagination. You're not a creative, or you don't identify yourself to be a creative. At your heart, you probably are. You're maybe socialized out of it. But the element of creativity does not end in the products and offering in just what we've created a subsistence creative economy. The element of creativity also applies to your financial thinking. It applies to your negotiating contracts for people so that as an artist, I feel welcomed, I feel appreciated. And when we speak to people, I'm a management professional as well, who are at workplaces, some executives assume that fulfilling compensation is increase in salary. And that's not always the case. It can be space for growth. It can be acknowledgments for accomplishments in the workplace. It can be building a community that understands my value and feeds into me as a professional. So what I've done is to take a corporate setting and ways of working and say, for those of you who are thinking of business opportunities on the continent, particularly at a time when there's a pandemic, and maybe your favorite international investor is no longer interested in Africa, there's so many opportunities within the creative industry space for you to think creatively, for you to think from a community level, validate it with a fan base, for you to create an empathetic, loyal fan base. Same thing Steve Jobs did with Apple. Similar things that folks have done using connectivity, but let it be from Africa. And for you not to copy and paste exploitative contracts. Let us get into a space where the world of finance is copying the creative arts enablement of feeling valued, of being a creative worker, not an exploitative clock in, clock out person. And these are opportunities that the creative industry presents for those who identify themselves to be creatives and for economic opportunists who identify themselves to be entrepreneurs.
Natalie says, thank you, Emmanuel. I've always found it hard to be an artist and a business person. Selling what I create kills my joy. And yet I need to sell. I always needed someone else to take care of the business side of things for me. I wasn't blessed with attributes for creation and business.
No, absolutely. I think one of the things that is really easy in my experience, if you are good at something, is to try to go at it alone. And you may go fast in a specific direction, but for you to leave a legacy, for you to build something that is larger than yourself, you do need community. And you need to learn how to collaborate. And you need to learn how to resolve conflicts. And I think for us creatives, or creative-minded people, or people who are paying attention to creatives, or fans of creatives, there's a label and tag that creatives are difficult people. I can't get this output. And part of my challenge to all of us is not to look at creatives as livestock. We're not chickens to be giving out eggs of glorious glamour per month. I don't even think chickens are meant to be that way. So there's a whole movement pushing back on organic chickens to allow them to roost their eggs in their best environment because it's healthier. And so if we can extend our thinking for chickens that way, why are we truncating it for creatives and making it seem like the only way value add can come out of our creatives is if we turn them into manufacturing agents, creating a lot of guidelines, but making it seem like that is the metric for output success. That's unfair.
I have one last question for you.
Sure.
We're in this moment in history where the world's attention once again has shifted to the continent. I don't know if the gaze ever left, but it seems like that gaze is, the volume is turned very, very high up on that gaze right now.
Yes.
You know, it's kind of a moment akin to like the Harlem Renaissance, but it's the entire continent and the diaspora going through it. Can you just reflect on how you see this moment?
Okay.
And what opportunities does this moment present for us on the continent in terms of taking ownership of our own creativity using technology?
Excellent. I think over the last 2 decades or so, the transition has also been like the African narrative. And I think that part of what may have triggered that also was a potential boom in economic standings from the late 2010s into, or 2000s into 2010s, where we could see, because of demand of Africa's commodity from China, there was an economic discussion to have about Africa's rising. And so those of us who, at the time I was in the diaspora, felt like, oh my goodness, it seems as if we're finally having voices that look like us, sound like us, Chimamanda Adichie, Komla Dumont, Fred Swanica, all of these other folks have a global TED Talk platform. And it's intentional because I think that the world of capitalism is purely opportunist. And so in a space where there seems to be an untapped market, including narrative pilfering, I think that there should be a bit of circumspection around that. I'm absolutely excited about everything African and Black. I am unabashedly a promoter of all things from my culture. And so the other side of it is the excitement to see Times, National Geographic, all of these people, especially with all their predominantly white editors and others, celebrate what we've always known in a better light. Where I challenge it though is the structure, the team, the thinking value, and the decision-making has still not changed. And so when I think of engagements in the diaspora and I think of narratives on Africa, the foundational hinge points shouldn't be the stories. It should be the decision makers that fund the agencies that hire the editors and story writers. And on that space, we're lacking behind, and we may get caught up in the euphoria of representation when we should be architecting the establishment of dominance. Thank you. Excellent. It's been an amazing time having all of you. The team here has been phenomenal. from UJ Arts and Culture, Andani.Africa, the team behind the scenes. They're an amazing group of folks. I've had the most amazing time. You should see the smiles and encouragements and thumbs up. I hope you have as well. Please continue to stay tuned. It's a 2-day Futures and Beyond Forum. Continue to follow on social media, UJ Arts and Culture, Andani.Africa. We look forward to hearing from you. Leave your comments, even the ones that you didn't get to ask. And thank you so much for watching.